Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. We're going to be looking at some really interesting stuff today. A new method called TableRAG that basically helps language models understand and answer questions about large tables of data.
Right.
We see everywhere, like, spreadsheets and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. So we're talking about data that's organized in rows and columns.
Yeah, exactly. And the goal today is to help you understand how TableRAG works and why it's a big deal.
Yeah.
In a world where AI is, more and more used to process information every day.
Right.
And we're going to be looking at the research paper that introduced TableRAG. But don't worry, we'll break it down into
Yeah, we'll make it easy to understand.
easy to understand pieces for you and really focus on those key insights.
Yeah. The paper is called TableRAG, Million Token Table Understanding with Language Models
Okay,
by Xian Chen and his team.
cool. So let's start with the problem.
Okay.
Why do language models struggle with large tables? It's not
Yeah.
like they're allergic to spreadsheets or something, right?
Well, not quite. Think of it this way. Language models have a limited amount of memory, we can call it, or context length.
Okay.
So trying to feed them an entire table, especially one with, millions of cells, is like trying to make someone understand an entire book by just like reading every single word to them one by one.
Right.
It's just not efficient.
Okay, so that's where TableRAG comes in.
Yeah,
It's like a smarter approach to solving this problem.
exactly. TableRAG, as they described it in Section 3, uses this method called Retrieval-Augmented Generation, or RAG for short.
Gotcha.
And instead of trying to cram that whole table into the language model's memory,
Okay.
it focuses on finding the most relevant parts.
So it's like a detective almost.
Yeah, like a detective gathering clues before they solve the case.
Okay, so walk me through this detective work then.
Sure.
How does TableRAG actually find those clues?
So it's a three-step process,
Okay.
and they illustrate this in Figure 2.
Okay.
The first step is something they call tabular query expansion.
Oh.
And basically what happens is the language model starts by asking itself clarifying questions about your initial question.
Interesting.
Almost like it's figuring out the best search terms to use.
So it's not just kind of going in blindly?
No, not at all. It's being very strategic.
Okay, cool.
And once it has those search terms, it moves on to the next step, schema and cell retrieval.
Okay.
And this is where it looks at the table schema. Think of it like the blueprint of the table, the column names, and it identifies which ones seem most relevant to the question.
So if I was asking about average prices, it wouldn't look at shipping dates or...
Exactly. It would narrow down the search to just the relevant information.
Okay.
And it goes even further. It actually looks at the cell values themselves
Wow.
and pulls out any that match those keywords.
Figure 8 provides a nice visual example of this process.
Okay, so now we've got the language model armed with a handful of carefully selected column names.
Right.
And some specific cell values. What happens next?
So the final step is where things get really interesting.
This is where the program-aided solver comes in, as they described it in Section 3.3. With those key pieces of information in hand, the language model actually writes a small program to find the answer.
So it's not even just searching anymore. It's like processing and coming up with an answer based on what it's found.
Yeah, it's like having a mini programmer inside the model itself.
That's so cool.
And this approach, as they highlight in Section 3.4, has some major advantages when it comes to handling these massive tables we've been talking about.
Like scalability, being able to handle, data sets with millions of cells.
Yes, exactly, as evidenced by those data sets, with millions of cells shown in Table 7.
Okay.
TableRAG can handle those without breaking a sweat.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's not just that it can handle the scale, but it's also efficient, right?
Exactly.
Because we talked about the limited memory.
Right.
So by just focusing on the relevant parts of the table, it saves a lot of time and resources.
Right, and that's where the token complexity analysis in Section 3.4 comes in. They compare TableRAG to other methods in terms of token complexity, which is basically how much information the model has to process.
Right.
TableRAG is much more efficient. You can see that in Table 1.
Okay, so we have a system that's scalable and efficient, but the question is, does it actually work?
That's what the researchers set out to test.
Okay.
And the results are pretty impressive.
All right.
So they tested TableRAG on 2 large-scale real-world data sets called Arcade QA and BIRD-QA.
Okay.
These are described in detail in section 4.1, and they contain, real code and real tables, not just made-up examples.
So real challenges.
Exactly. And TableRAG, as you can see in Table 2, consistently outperformed other state-of-the-art methods on both of those data sets.
Wow.
They even tested it with different language models like GPT 3.5 Turbo, Gemini 1.0 Pro, and Mistral Nemo.
So it's not just a one-trick pony. It works across different...
It's not. It's pretty versatile.
Okay, cool. And understand why it performs so well, we need to look at the retrieval performance analysis in Table 3. And this is where they measured how good each method was at finding the truly relevant information in the table.
Right, not just any information, but the right information.
Right.
And TableRAG really excels at that.
Okay.
It has high recall, meaning it finds most of the relevant information, and high precision, meaning the information that it finds is actually relevant.
So it's not just casting a wide net, it's making sure it's catching the right fish.
Exactly.
Okay, so this is all great in theory, but can you walk me through a specific example?
Absolutely.
So we can really see this in action.
So Figure 8 shows how TableRAG tackles a question about average prices for leather wallets.
Okay.
You can see the whole process there, from the initial question to the final answer.
So we can actually see it solving a real-world problem.
Yes.
This is great. Okay, so we've been talking about these large data sets.
Right.
What about smaller tables? The kind you might find in a research paper or a financial report. Does TableRAG work there too?
That's a great question. And in section 4.7, they actually tested TableRAG on a smaller data set called WikiTableQA.
Okay.
Which is a well-established benchmark in the field. And guess what?
I'm guessing it still came out on top.
It outperformed other methods like Tabert, text-to-SQL, Binder, and Dater.
Okay, so TableRAG is versatile. It can handle both large and small tables.
Yes.
Okay, this sounds almost too good to be true. Are there any limitations?
Of course, every superhero has a weakness.
Right.
And in section 6, they point out a couple of potential challenges.
Okay.
For example, if a table has entirely unique values in each cell, like imagine millions of rows where each cell contains a different word or number, then TableRAG's approach might struggle.
That makes sense. It's like trying to find a pattern in a completely random sequence of letters.
Exactly. And they also point out that their evaluation focused mainly on question answering tasks.
So there's still more research to be done on how TableRAG could be applied to other types of tasks.
Right.
Okay, well, before we jump into the future of TableRAG, let's rewind a bit and look at some of the experiments they did to really understand how it works.
You're talking about the ablation studies in section 4.8, where they essentially took TableRAG apart piece by piece to see how each component contributes to its overall performance.
Exactly. They tested different retrieval methods, different encoding budgets.
Right.
And even the impact of that query expansion step we talked about earlier.
Right. And one of the most interesting findings was that TableRAG's default embedding-based retrieval method, described in section 3.2, actually outperformed other methods, even those that could process every single cell in the table.
Wow.
So even though it can't see everything, TableRAG's embedding-based retrieval still manages to find the most relevant information.
Because it's understanding the meaning and the context of the words and the values.
Exactly. It's another testament to the power of semantic understanding.
That's so cool. What about those top retrieval results that they experimented with in Figure 5? Did they find that more is always better?
Not necessarily. They actually found that having too many pieces of information, even if they're relevant, can overwhelm the language model.
Oh, interesting. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with too many pieces. It becomes harder to see the bigger picture.
Right. It gets lost in the details.
Exactly. And they also tested different encoding budgets, which is denoted by the letter B. And it determines how many distinct cell values TableRAG can store and search through. And Figure 6 shows that TableRAG's performance remained really consistent, even as the budget got smaller.
So it's robust.
Yeah, it can handle limitations in memory without sacrificing accuracy.
It is very cool. And Figure 7 showed that the query expansion step, where the model asks itself those clarifying questions, consistently improved performance.
Right. It's all about being thorough.
Yeah. And then finally, Table 6 breaks down the impact of schema retrieval and cell retrieval individually.
Right. And they found that both are essential for TableRAG's accuracy. Removing either one led to a noticeable drop in performance.
So it's really a synergistic approach.
Yes. All the pieces work together to get the best result.
Very cool. All right. So, yeah, it really is a synergistic approach. All the pieces work together, and they even provide a nice example to illustrate this.
Okay.
In Appendix A, it's aptly titled TableRAG Example.
So this is where we get to see it in action.
Exactly like a real detective case.
I like it.
They present a scenario where the question is, what is the average price for leather wallets?
Okay.
And then they walk us through how TableRAG solves it.
So let's put on our detective hats and follow along.
Okay.
What's the first clue?
So they start by showing the actual prompts used for that tabular query expansion, both for the schema query and the cell query.
Okay.
It's really fascinating to see how the model breaks down that initial question into these like sub-queries almost.
So it's like it's figuring out the best angles to approach the problem from.
Precisely. And then they show the schema database and the cell database that are created based on the table's data.
Okay.
Remember those carefully selected column names and cell values we talked about?
Right.
This is where they come into play.
So it's like the model's evidence board, almost, right? All the key pieces laid out.
A perfect analogy. And then comes the program-aided LLM solver. This is the brains of the operation.
Okay.
They show the actual prompt that's given to the language model, which includes the question, those selected schema and cell values, and instructions on how to use the Python replas tool. This tool allows the model to actually execute Python code.
Wow. So it's like the model is given a set of tools and instructions, and it's told to go analyze the evidence and find the answer.
Exactly. And they show us the model's thought process step by step. Its thought, the action it takes in the form of Python code, and the observation that it makes based on the results.
Wow.
It's amazing to see how it filters the data, performs calculations, and ultimately arrives at the correct answer.
It's like watching a master detective at work.
It really is, and they even provide the final output. The average price for leather wallets is $442.79.
Case closed. TableRAG has solved the mystery.
Indeed, a fantastic illustration of the method's capabilities.
Okay, so we've talked about the theory, we've seen an example, but what about the actual code behind all of this?
Well, don't worry, the researchers have got us covered.
Okay.
In Appendix B, they provide a detailed breakdown of the TableRAG algorithm using pseudocode, which is a way to represent the logic in a human-readable format.
Okay, so even if we're not expert programmers, we can still kind of get a glimpse behind the curtain.
Absolutely. They explain each function step by step, showing how they build the schema and cell databases, how they retrieve the information, and ultimately use that program-aided solver to put everything together.
It's like a well-oiled machine.
It is, with each part playing a crucial role. And to make it even more concrete, they provide the actual prompts that are used for that query expansion in Appendix D and Appendix E. So Appendix D focuses on schema retrieval, where the model is prompted to suggest relevant column names.
And Appendix E shows the prompt for cell retrieval.
You got it. This one guides the model to extract keywords from the question that might be present in the table cells.
So it's all about guiding the model to ask the right questions, which then lead to the right answers.
Precisely. And finally, Appendix F reveals the complete prompt for the TableRAG solver. This is the one that gives the language model all the information and instructions it needs to actually tackle the problem.
It's like the ultimate guide to understanding TableRAG's inner workings. Okay, so we briefly touched on the data sets that were used to evaluate TableRAG, like Arcade QA and BIRD-QA.
Right.
But what are those other ones they mentioned in Section 4.1?
Right. So Appendix C, titled Dataset, gives us a more detailed overview.
Okay.
So it describes Arcade QA, which comes from a data set of annotated data science notebooks.
Okay.
And then BIRD-QA, which is derived from text-to-SQL examples.
So these are based on real-world code and data, not just hypothetical examples.
Exactly. And then there's synthetic TabFact, which is based on a real-world data set called TabFact. But they expanded it to create much larger tables, ranging in size from 50 by 50 to a massive 1,000 by 1,000.
Wow, 1 million cells.
Yeah.
It's pushing the limit.
It is. And they explain their methodology for creating these synthetic tables, ensuring that they retain the complexity and challenges of the original data.
It's like building a training ground for TableRAG.
Exactly.
Allowing it to flex its muscles on tables of all shapes and sizes.
Yes, and to get a clearer picture of these data sets, Table 7 provides a nice summary of the key statistics for each data set, the number of tables, the number of questions, the average number of rows and columns, even the average number of distinct values in each table.
So we can really see the sheer scale and diversity of the data sets they used.
Exactly. And all of this points to the robustness and the adaptability of TableRAG as a method for understanding and answering questions about tabular data.
It's clear that TableRAG represents a significant leap forward in the field. It really does sound like a big step forward. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From, understanding the problem to actually seeing TableRAG in action.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I'm curious, what stood out to you the most about TableRAG?
I think for me, it's the way TableRAG combines those two seemingly different worlds of like unstructured language and structured data.
Yeah.
Traditionally, these have been treated separately, but now we're starting to see these tools that can seamlessly navigate between them.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah, it's like giving language models this whole new way to interact with information.
Exactly. And that opens up all these possibilities for how we analyze and use data in the future.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into TableRAG.
It has.
For those of you who want to explore further, we highly recommend checking out the full research paper.
Yes, definitely.
And as always, we like to leave you with something to ponder.
All right.
What's the question that's got you thinking?
Well, the researchers focused on how well TableRAG performs on question answering tasks, right? But I'm curious about other potential applications.
Yeah.
Like, could it be used to generate summaries of key insights from large tables, or maybe identify patterns and anomalies that would be really difficult for humans to spot?
Those are great questions. It seems like we've only just scratched the surface of what TableRAG and these kinds of methods might be capable of.
I think so. It's what makes this field so exciting. There's always more to discover.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into TableRAG.
Thanks for having me.
And until next time, keep exploring the world of data and AI.